Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to rise in this House as always, representing the people of Timmins-James Bay on this Bill C-9, an act respecting the election and terms of office of chief and councillors of certain First Nations and the composition of councils of those First Nations. Mr. Speaker, this is yet another bill that's being brought forward to tinker with the highly problematic Indian Act. It comes at a time of where the breach in relationship between the Government of Canada, the Crown, and First Nations across this country is at a very stark moment in our Canadian history, where a government seems to believe that it can move back towards a colonial relationship with the First Peoples of this country, and that it is the power of the minister to make decisions that really belong in communities. There are elements in this bill, Mr. Speaker, about tinkering with the problems of the Elections Act that we've seen. There are elements in this bill about trying to alleviate some of the problems that we've seen with the Indian Act. But the fundamental problem, Mr. Speaker, is the breach of trust and relationship that is not being done with the communities. Once again, it is Ottawa, it's the Department of Indian Affairs imposing on the people themselves how situations are going to be resolved, rather than recognizing that in the 21st century it's not acceptable to treat an entire section of our Canadian population basically as a hostage people under a bureaucracy. Mr. Speaker, as we speak in my communities, we are now in probably about the 15th state of emergency that I've seen on the James Bay region due to chronic infrastructure and failed government plans for basic health and safety and housing. We have 70 people who were burnt out of a construction trailer. Now, Mr. Speaker, for the people back home to understand what this is not living quarters. This was a bunkhouse that was brought in on an emergency basis after 2008 infrastructure collapse in Attawapiskat, where the sewage system failed. Now, most people in Canada have no concept of how a municipal infrastructure like sewage would fail, but in each one of my communities, Mr. Speaker, on the James Bay, I've seen the complete collapse of sewage or water from underfunding, from poorly planned projects. Fort Albany, complete collapse of infrastructure in the winter of 2009. Saskatchewan, 2005-06, where we had to bring the entire evacuation of 2,000 people out of Saskatchewan. Attawapiskat, 2008. And again, 2011. In 2008, Mr. Speaker, when the sewage backed up and destroyed numerous houses in Attawapiskat, the community called on the federal government for help. And here's what the federal government did. They just said, you're on your own. We talk about the financial problems in these communities. It was the community themselves who were forced to evacuate 80 people to accommodations in Cochrane and pay for hotels for months on end at the expense of the band, which put the band seriously in debt. Mr. Speaker, we just had a report from the Auditor General on the complete failure of basic safety protocols from the federal government, that the government sets aside $19 million to deal with emergencies, whether they be fire, whether they be flood, other needs for evacuation. $19 million across Canada. When what they spend is anywhere in 2009-10 was $286 million. So $180 million of that went on response and recovery, but only $4 million on prevention and mitigation. So what that means, Mr. Speaker, is that they had to take money from building schools. They had to take money from safe water. They had to take money from building houses to deal with whatever the emergency was at the time. And I want to put this in context. There's not a single community, non-native community in this country, that if there was a fire, the government would turn around and say, well, guess what? There's no more schools in your district for the next 5 years. They would never say, we're not building you a hospital. You know why? Because you people ended up getting flooded out. We saw the incredible response in High River and Calgary, across Canada, the federal government, the provincial government, to help the residents there. But when our communities are flooded out, Mr. Speaker, we see the derision and the abuse from the trolls all over the main media sites, blaming the people, laughing at the people for being the victims of a natural disaster, and we see the government choosing to ignore them. Under Mr. Speaker, this destabilizes band councils in their ability to deal with the developments of their communities, because they're always having to try and find money to deal with the fundamental problem, which is the failed infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, I want to also speak that as we're talking in this House about this government-imposed bill that has not been done with proper consultations, about the deep sense of broken trust that exists with First Nation communities and this government, in particular the abuse of the Aboriginal residential school apology. I stood in this House, Mr. Speaker. It was the proudest moment of my life as a parliamentarian to see the Government of Canada acknowledge what had been done in the residential schools. And since that day, that proud day, I've seen systematic attack on the survivors of these institutions by this federal government, in particular the victims who survived St. Anne's Residential School and the long histories of abuse and degradation that happened in the residential schools. St. Anne's stands out as a particularly dark and brutal story. And Mr. Speaker, in 1992, the Ontario Provincial Police launched an investigation into the abuse that went on at St. Anne's. It was probably the largest police investigation into child torture and abuse of its kind outside of Mount Cashel. Over 900 witness statements were gathered. Thousands of pages of documents were subpoenaed and obtained from the Catholic Church in Montreal and Moose Factory. The OPP did an extraordinary job. Mr. Speaker, when the survivors of St. Anne's finally came forward to be part of this independent assessment process, which the government set up and told the people who survived this brutal institution, if you come forward and tell your stories, we'll work this out with you. And the legal responsibility of the federal government at that time, laid out in the terms of agreement under the independent assessment process, Schedule D, Appendix 8 and Appendix 10, was that the federal government would provide a narrative, a written record of all the known documentation of abuse that occurred at St. Anne's. The federal government, though, chose not to tell any of the survivors or their legal teams or their adjudicators about the thousands of pages of police evidence that the federal government was aware of, thereby undermining and compromising the independent assessment process. Now, I wrote to the Indian Affairs Minister about this breach because this is serious. The obligation to disclose evidence is a fundamental principle of justice, Mr. Speaker. And the Indian Affairs Minister wrote on July 17th, Canada is of course aware of Ontario Provincial Police investigations regarding St. Anne's Residential School and the resulting trials. However, he said that it was not their job to obtain this evidence, and it certainly wasn't their responsibility to tell the survivors. He also claimed that this evidence wasn't even admissible. He said statements made to the Ontario Provincial Police in the course of their investigations cannot be used as evidence at the independent assessment hearing. Only the oral testimony of a witness is considered evidence. And he referred me to page 10, paragraphs 10 of the terms of agreement. And I read that. And it says nothing of the kind, Mr. Speaker. So I have the Indian Affairs Minister putting on record something that is completely false about the withholding of evidence about the abuse and torture of children. In fact, the terms of agreement of the independent assessment process says the exact opposite, Mr. Speaker, to what the Indian Affairs Ministers claimed. It said that findings of previous criminal or criminal trials may be accepted without further proof. And this is the key issue. The poor survivors who've chosen to come forward, and I know many, many people in our communities in Fort Albany, in Moose Factory, Attawapiskat, Pewanak, who've not participated in the independent assessment process because they couldn't bear the trauma of being challenged and having to go through the process again. And yet, under this government, the government knew all the evidence was verifying, particularly the evidence that the administrators of this school built an electric chair to electrocute children for the kicks of staff. That was in the police affidavits. And so the survivors coming forward have to tell this only to be challenged by federal lawyers who say that this is not true, that this isn't admissible. But Mr. Speaker, this is the real key of the breach of trust that shows the dark, dark heart of this government. When this issue of the fact that they suppressed evidence and compromised the Truth and Reconciliation process was brought out and exposed, the government admitted that they needed to deal with this at the Ontario Superior Court. So next Tuesday, December 17th, this issue will be addressed at Ontario Superior Court. But, Mr. Speaker, what we found out since the letter of July 17th from the Indian Affairs Minister is that the federal government had this evidence all along. The federal government went to Ontario Court in 2003 and demanded access to all the police evidence. Now, they weren't doing that on behalf of the victims. They said that they, as the defendant, the entity responsible for the abuse of these children, that it was their right to be able to access the thousands of pages of police testimony and the 900 and some witness documents about the abuse that was perpetrated against the children. The federal government in 2003 got that evidence, and in Justice Traynor's 2003 decision, Justice Traynor said that this evidence was to be used and should be used by future plaintiffs. Well, the future plaintiffs were not told that, Mr. Speaker. The future plaintiffs were lied to in a legal process that they participated in. The evidence was suppressed. Mr. Speaker, this is a serious, serious breach of the fiduciary and legal obligations. The federal government acts as both the defendant in this case against the abuse of these children, but it also acts under the obligation of the independent assessment process to provide evidence, all the evidence, so that it can be adjudicated by the legal teams. The decision to suppress this evidence and say that they didn't know where it was, that they didn't have access to it, and in fact they even tried to claim privacy right provisions to prevent the survivors from seeing this. Mr. Speaker, the people that I represent in our communities, they still live with the abuse that went on at St. Anne's. There's not a family I met who still aren't trying to put the pieces back together, the intergenerational damage that was done, the outright attempt to destroy the James Bay people through this horrific institution. And the federal government knew the extent of the abuse. They knew the number of perpetrators of this abuse, and they sat on it, and they told the survivors who came before a legal process that there was no evidence to back up their claims. Mr. Speaker, when I go home to James Bay, and when I go home to see the survivors in Fort Albany, I really don't know what to tell them about a government that could be that mercenary and cold-blooded. So when this government comes forward with their colonial attitude about First Nation education and their spin and their misinformation and their attacks on the leadership in these communities and their blames about this being this big waste on the taxpayers, the communities that I represent know that this is a government that has not shown any good faith towards them. That this is a government that has breached the fundamental promise that this Prime Minister made when he stood up and told the survivors of the residential schools the system that was set to destroy the Indian in the child. Under Duncan Scott, going back, a system that was meant to eradicate a people. This government is continuing on a process of treating the survivors and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who suffered under this system in a manner that is abusive and fails to show respect. So, Mr. Speaker, we can continue to talk about tinkering with the Indian Act. We can talk about long-term goals, but I've never heard any long-term goals from this government when it comes to First Nations. Or we can say that something fundamentally wrong happened when the treaties were breached, when the children were sent off to the residential schools, and that it's within the House of the House of the Common People of Canada to repair that breach. And we need to do it by moving away from the abusive, disinterested, arrogant attitude, and I would also say the incompetent attitude of this government when it comes to First Nation communities, First Nation governance, First Nation children. You know, Mr. Speaker, right now, the Indian Affairs Minister has his First Nations Education Act. I've never seen a man have to run so fast from legislation that he said was going to be the great benefit to all the First Nation children. He's having to run from it because they have not consulted with the communities. Again, they're attempting to impose a model that no other community in this country would allow that model to be imposed, because education is about children. Education is child-centered. This government believes it can bring in some edicts and it'll change things. But they don't understand this Indian Affairs Minister is de facto the education minister of one of the largest school populations in this country. He can't even tell you how many schools are condemned. He can't even tell you how many schools need building. He can't tell you the per pupil cost of what it means to educate a child under his watch. Speaker, that's a level of negligence. It's astounding because we're talking about children. So the threat the government's making now on the First Nations Education Act is saying, hey, we're going to put a little bit of money on the table. You either play ball, or we take the money away. It's this attitude that they can dangle a carrot before communities that have substandard education. In communities like mine, Attawapiskat, where after 13, 14, 15 years, we may finally get a school. We'll finally get a school. Kashechewan, my community, grade school still not happening. I can name you communities across this country where the schools have been condemned for years. So they're offering, we'll put a little bit of money on the table, and then either people will come to the table and do what we tell them to do, or we're taking the money away. You have to ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, what kind of government would use children as bargaining chips? To say, do you want to have some kind of education? We'll put some money in. Now, we used to hear the minister tell us that, oh, we give more money to First Nation children than they get in the provincial system. But of course, he was laughed out of the room for that one. So now he's saying, you either come and we'll give you a little bit of money, or we're pulling the whole project. And Mr. Speaker, I asked what kind of government would use children as bargaining chips, and I remember in 2011, 2012, when the federal government imposed a third-party manager on the band in Attawapiskat, and they thought the community would fold, and the community didn't fold, and they went to court. And when they went to court, the government cut off all the funding to the community, including the education. So we went 2 months. 2 months without education dollars. Now, that would be illegal in any other jurisdiction, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. Imagine a fight with the municipal government. We've had many fights with municipal governments. Imagine a fight with the municipal government in Toronto saying, we're cutting off the money to all the schools until you comply with your mayor. That would never happen, but that's what they did in Attawapiskat. And they imposed this third-party manager at, what was it, $1,800 a day? I think he was making more money than the Prime Minister. And yet we were having students being evicted out of the college because the money wasn't being transferred for their college funds. So, Mr. Speaker, there's some fundamental problems with the relationship. And I'd like to say to my honourable colleagues, it doesn't have to be this way. When I look at the First Nation communities across this country, I see such immense possibilities. I see young leadership who are coming forward, who are inspired. I'm seeing a whole new generation on the James Bay coast of young, articulate leaders who see a much bigger world, who want to be part of that world. I see industry coming to us and saying, we want to find ways to work and get peace on the ground for development. We understand the importance of peace on the ground. We understand that for development to happen, we need trained, empowered First Nation communities. But what I don't see is the federal government at the table. For example, the Ring of Fire. This government claimed that the Ring of Fire...
Point of order, the Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe we're debating the First Nations Elections Act, and I think the record will reflect that we haven't heard this member actually even come close to the ambit of discussion around First Nations Election Act. I can appreciate that his next sentence was something like he appreciates what this government has done to invest in educational opportunities for the Ring of Fire, and that would be a good talking line for him. Unfortunately, this debate has to do with First Nations Elections Act. Nothing about what he said since he started his speech. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I came in partway through, into the chair partway through, and I must admit I haven't heard anything about the Elections Act. The member from Timmins-James Bay only has about a minute left, so perhaps he could address his closing comments with regard
Thank you, and
to that
Mr. Chair,
legislation.
I'll certainly send you the blues to help you out so that you will understand the erudite nature. And before I finish off, I'd like to point out that I think my honourable colleague was getting a little tense because the Ring of Fire is near his area, and the fact that this government blew it. I don't want to embarrass him, but this is why we go back to the issue of governance, Mr. Speaker. We need to deal with this issue of governance. The issue that we're talking about here is the breach of faith. The governance between First Nations and the government needs to be based on trust. And we haven't seen any of that level of trust. So we can hear all the talking points we want on how they blew it in the Ring of Fire. But the communities don't trust them. And neither should they trust them. So we can, as I said earlier on in my speech, Mr. Speaker, we can tinker with the problems of the Indian Act, but the fundamental problem is the relationship.